can I say what a pleasure it is to be here in Kochi. I have been to Japan several times previously, but this is the first occasion on which I visited this very attractive city in its mountain surroundings. I think the same applies to some of you too. You're here for the first time and you see what a nice place it is. Now, intonation, variation in the pitch of the voice. This is one of the obvious characteristics of spoken language. Because no language is spoken on a monotone, you don't get any language in which all words come on the same pitch of the voice, not going up and not going down. No, in real languages, the pitch changes. It goes down, it goes up, it goes down and up again, it goes up and down again. And that's what we're analysing when we talk about intonation. Now, some languages make a different use of the movement of the pitch of the voice by using it lexically. These are the tone languages, and as I'm sure you know, a good example of a tone language is Chinese, where in Chinese, if we take the syllable ma, it can have different meanings, ma, 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 depending on the pitch. And this has 4 different lexical meanings, dictionary meanings, meaning mother, horse, scold, and hemp, respectively. And that sort of thing, of course, we don't have in English, and we don't have in Japanese. We don't use pitch variation lexically. What we do is use pitch for intonation, which means that we add certain kinds of meaning to longer stretches of speech. Maybe adding an attitude, an implication, maybe indicating our own viewpoint about what we're saying, maybe distinguishing different grammatical constructions, maybe just signaling the general structure of our message. There are various things that intonation does. But I think it's worth emphasizing that it is at least partly linguistic, by which I mean that it's part of the language system. There are other things that we do when we speak which are not part of the language system. I'm thinking, for example, of the question of how loudly one speaks. Now, in public situations, or to be heard in a large hall, one speaks fairly loudly. In an intimate conversation with another person, you talk softly. In an intimate conversation with one person, you might talk very softly. That's not linguistic. That's something that's, as we say, paralinguistic or extralinguistic, not part of the language system. Some people feel that intonation is like that, but I disagree. I think intonation is part of the language system because speakers make systemic choices. Just as we choose to use a present tense or a past tense or a future tense, we choose in English to use a singular or a plural, we choose in all the time, transitive verb, intransitive verb, countable noun, uncountable noun. We're making choices as we speak. Similarly with intonation, we're choosing how to structure things, where to put the brakes, where to focus on, what to emphasize, what kind of a tone to use, what we imply about what we're saying. Now, there are obvious surface differences between language in their intonation. Indeed, within languages, different varieties of the same language may have obvious surface differences of intonation. If we compare my intonation with that of somebody from Glasgow or Belfast, we can immediately recognise that West of Scotland or Northern Ireland intonation is very different from that's used in the rest of the English-speaking world, really. I believe in Japanese you have similarly fairly marked differences of intonation in different parts of the country. In Osaka, different from in Tokyo, and in Fukuoka, something different again. But these differences, I think, are mainly what we would call superficial. They're to do with the realization of the system rather than with the system that underlies all of this. They're etic, in a sense, rather than emic. The question is, how much is actually universal? and how much of the difference between languages is just a matter of this surface difference, this etic difference, or whether there are real, genuine linguistic differences between languages as well. I come to the conclusion that languages differ in the extent to which they exploit intonation to encode meaning. Clearly in English we do use intonation quite a lot to encode certain aspects of our meaning when we speak. It seems to me that some other languages make less use of intonation, and some languages make very little use of intonation. In Cantonese Chinese, as far as I can see, you really have the tones for the individual words, you have a general declination or downdrift, then you have a particle at the end, and you load all the intonation meaning onto that particle. So that's a very different way of doing it from what we do in English. The relevance of this for language teaching is, of course, that what is universal, shared by all languages, does not need to be taught, because we know it. But what is language specific, what varies from one language to another, does need to be taught, or putting it more mildly, may need to be taught. It may be desirable that it should be taught, or at least learned by the language learner. Well, the way I'm going to present things is in terms of three types of systemic choice. Those of you who know about intonation will know that this goes back to Halliday's analysis in the 1960s. Halliday was the first to identify these three systems that he claimed were in operation in English intonation, perhaps more generally in most languages. The first of these, which Halliday calls tonality, concerns the location of the intonation breaks. How do we chunk the material? How do we break the stretches of speech up into separate pieces? Where do the boundaries between intonation phrases go? This seems to be, in fact, pretty largely universal. People find this a matter of common sense. They don't need to be taught it explicitly. The second question, the matter of tone. What tones are used? What are the tones? This is not self-evident at all in English. I operate in terms of three basic tones, a fall, a rise, and a fall rise. But it's clear that we can subdivide each of these, and some people like to start straight away with more tones, a high fall versus a low fall, a low rise versus a high rise, and so on. So there's a question of how many tones it's helpful to identify at the first level. Certainly, this varies from one language to another. The English fall rise, such a very typical pattern in English. I was counting Patricia Ashby using four rises. You know, they were coming all the time because she's a native speaker of English. That's what we do. But when I listen to Japanese speakers of English, I don't hear very many four rises because that's not something that you do. Well, in tone, as far as tone is concerned, there's often a lot of choice, a lot of freedom. It's not necessarily a mistake not to use a four rise, but to sound more native-like, perhaps you do need to use four rises quite often. I heard Professor Taniguchi speaking this morning elsewhere, and I noted with great pleasure four rises coming through, and that makes him a good speaker of English to me. All right. The third issue then is tonicity, as Halliday calls it, which is to do with accentuation. Which items do we accent? Which items do we highlight? Which items do we focus on? Because as we speak, some of what we say is more important than other things. And we signal this relative importance as we go by using accentuation. Now this is very definitely language specific, as we can see by comparing English with quite neighbouring languages in Europe, compared with French, enormous differences. Even compared with Spanish, which generally has the similar sort of intonation to English, there are important differences in tonicity. Well, let's see some examples of these three different systems in practice. Here's tonality, first of all, the matter of boundaries. Supposing we take the sentence, there's cheese, salad and quiche, on a monotone, that's not how we say it. Version 1, there's cheese, salad and quiche. Okay, three possibilities. There are the pictures, some cheese, some salad and some quiche. Second possibility, there's cheese, salad and quiche. Only two, either cheese, salad, compound noun, or quiche. Now, the words are the same, the vowels and consonants are the same, but the intonation is different. The first one, there's cheese, salad and quiche. The second one, there's cheese, salad and quiche. I think that's common sense. I don't think that's problematic. You appreciate the difference and you can see how it sounds. There it is marked up with some intonation marks. Now, what I want to do, following Halliday, is to distinguish between the system of tonality, the system of tonicity, and the system of tone in the intonation marking. So I show the location of the nucleus, the most important accent within each intonation phrase, by underlining the relevant syllable. I haven't yet indicated here what tones are used, but the beauty of using underlining is that it enables us to separate those two different issues. Where does the nucleus go? Then later we can think, what is the nuclear tone? The econominal system, unfortunately, requires you to make both decisions at once because you can only identify the nucleus through recognizing that its tone mark is one of the nuclear tone marks. I also think it's important to use a notation system that involves text ornamentation rather than text change. That is, we add marks to the ordinary orthography rather than changing the ordinary orthography. This is something I would criticize in Brazel's notation, and Brazel's followers, where to show the nucleus you usually have to put it in capitals, so change from lowercase to uppercase. And in Brazel's own system you indicate what he calls key by actually raising the whole level of the line of writing or lowering the whole level of the line of writing, very complicated text change. So I want just to be able to use ornamentation of text. Tonality is something that you can use to interest people in the general issue of intonation because there are lots of nice jokes that you can show them like this. At the top, what's that in the road ahead? At the bottom, what's that in the road? Ahead? Ha ha ha, yes. And you can devise further examples of the same thing. What did you see on the way across? What did you see on the way? Across? And so on. Yeah, self-evident, doesn't need to be taught, but it's amusing. It may be very important, though, for listening comprehension. Version 1. Do you like pawpaw? I'm sorry, I don't. No. Version 2. Do you like pawpaw? I'm sorry, I don't know. Now, this of course reflects the fact that no opposite of yes is a homophone of no have knowledge, which is a design fault in English. It's a problem in English. And in English we do often reinforce a negative answer by adding no. So we can say, I'm sorry, I don't. But we can also say, I don't know. Reinforce it. And that could easily be confused with, I don't know. I don't have the knowledge. But they are in fact distinct because of tonality. The first one has a boundary, an intonation break after don't, before no. The second one doesn't. So A again is, do you like pawpaw? I'm sorry, I don't. No. The second one is, do you like pawpaw? I'm sorry, I don't know. Of course, I am saying them in a clear way. Under certain circumstances, they might become very, very similar and lead to possible confusion. And of course, the second one is appropriate if you don't know what pawpaw is. This, in fact, is the usual British name for what the Americans call papaya. And there are some British people who call it papaya too. And there are others who just don't know it at all because it's a tropical fruit which, until recently, you never saw in Britain. So, to say I don't know is a reasonable answer to this question. But if you do know it, you can still say I don't know. Moving on to tone. It's not easy to find absolutely clear-cut examples of English in English where the choice of tone makes a difference to the interpretation. Because very often you can use a variety of different tones and the difference will be a matter of attitude or sort of secondary meaning rather than primary meaning. But here's a good example of the difference between a fall and a rise, a high fall versus a high rise. A says, Alvin saw his friends. B says, well, what does B say? B might say, who? Or B might say, who? Do you get the difference of meaning? Alvin saw his friends. Who? Alvin saw his friends. Who? The first one, Alvin saw his friends. Who? Means I didn't understand what you said. I didn't catch the name. Who are you talking about? The second one means Alvin saw his friends. Who? What are the names of the friends? Who are the friends? Which friends? So that is in fact conveyed by the choice of tone. The high rise asks for a repetition. It's what we call a pardon question. Pardon? Sorry, what did you say? The second one, the fall, asks for further amplification. It's an ordinary WH question. WH questions tend to have a fall. So the first means, please repeat, I didn't catch what you said. The second means, please amplify, who were the friends he saw. That difference is carried by tone. The general pattern in English then is for certain types of sentence to have a fall and others to have a rise. Now, we have a problem you may be familiar with when teaching intonation, that some students find it very difficult to hear the difference between a fall and a rise. Some people find it easy. People with musical ability, for them you just have to tell them, and you tell them once, and from then on it's obvious. They don't need to be taught. Others find it difficult. You give them ear training, and they still find it hard. Well, at least if they're native speakers of English, one way in is to make them think about exclamations, because exclamations have a fall. Wow! What a lovely day! What a beautiful surprise! What an awful lecture! Da, da, da! Falling tones. Exclamations have a fall. I suspect that this might be universal. When you have something in Japanese, they begin ne. Seems to me, I'm listening carefully to people talking Japanese, I hear these ne at the end, which I think indicates an exclamation. On the other hand, where do we find a rise? Most typically, in a pardon question, if you didn't understand what the person said. Huh? Sorry? What was that? Again, I don't know. Is this universal? Because if that's universal, that's a way. So you have to compare a given tone with an exclamation, which we know are falls, and with a pardon question, which we know are rises. That's perhaps a helpful starting point. There are some exclamations. It's wonderful. What a lovely day. Wasn't it awful? Now, this is an academic conference. If this was a group of teachers, I'd ask you to say these. Would you feel terribly offended if I asked you to say them and to do them after me? Let's do a fall. It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Wonderful.
What a lovely day.
What a lovely day.
Right. Wasn't it awful?
Wasn't it awful?
Okay. And here are some pardon questions. British type? Sorry? Sorry?
Sorry?
American type? Huh?
Huh? Huh?
Or other examples, how many?
How many?
There were 300 people in the room. How many?
How many?
How many? I swam the channel. You did what? You did what? You did what?
What?
Okay, pardon questions. I also find that it's helpful for beginners of English as a foreign language intonation to be given these simple rules. Although in English you can have virtually any tone for virtually any kind of sentence, except for exclamations and pardon questions, there is a default or a neutral or unmarked possibility that doesn't add any special meaning, and that's a rise in the case of yes-no questions, but a fall for everything else. Now that's a nice simple rule which people can learn and understand. It does require understanding the difference between a yes-no question and a WH question, but they have to learn that. So there are two examples of yes-no questions. Are you sitting comfortably? Are you sitting comfortably? Is that the right answer?
Is that the right answer?
And those of you who are very familiar with British and American pronunciation and how they differ may note here that there is a typical difference in those patterns. What I've given you is the British version. The more characteristic American one might be, are you sitting comfortably? And is that the right answer? Where the difference in intonation relates to the early part of the sentence. I always concentrate on the common core, the shared core, rather than getting too excited about the superficial differences between different varieties of the language. And British and American English both have exactly the same rising tone on the nucleus, starting at the nucleus. It's just that in Britain we tend to have a fairly high stuff before it. Are you sitting comfortably? Is that the right answer? Whereas Americans tend to stay down low before they rise. Are you sitting comfortably? Is that the right answer? And that is unimportant. Okay, here are some other types of clause. Statement. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. That's very interesting.
That's very interesting.
I don't believe it.
I don't
believe
believe
it.
it.
I don't believe
I
it.
don't believe it.
So a positive and a negative statement. And then a WH question. What's your name? What's your name?
What's your name?
What's your name?
What's your
Yeah.
name?
What's your name?
What's your name?
Now, do remember that this is the default pattern, the unmarked pattern. It's perfectly possible to say, what's your name? But it has a different meaning from what's your name? With a fall, what's your name? That's the neutral one, the ordinary one. What's the special meaning attached to what's your name? That has a special meaning. Well, it's the way you would speak to a small child. Hello, little girl. What's your name? It's the way you might speak to somebody who you thought might not understand you properly, and somebody who wasn't very intelligent. The consequence is that if you address it to another adult, it sounds patronizing. And it's therefore a bit dangerous to use it unless you intend to be patronizing. Certainly, for a business-like question, okay, let's fill in this form. Next question. What's your name? You must have a form. I haven't spoken yet about the four rise, the third of the tunes I mentioned, and the tones. And that is not really a default pattern of any major clause type. Nevertheless, it's very important in English because it's the tone that conveys implications. Intonation is really not shown in ordinary orthography, in ordinary writing. To some extent, of course, the tonality is indicated by the punctuation marks, which tell you how the stuff is structured. But the tone is certainly not shown. And this means that you can report somebody's words to a court of law or in a newspaper and faithfully, correctly say what the words were that they used. But you may be failing to report the implication of what they said if you don't also signal the intonation, which we usually don't. We even have a sort of regular saying for this in English. It's not what you said, it's the way that you said it that I found unacceptable. So it's not the words, not the choice of words, but the implications conveyed by the intonation. And this is where the four rise most typically comes in. Now, somebody tells you something, you might say, that's very interesting, straightforward. But you might say, oh, that's very interesting. Now that has an implication. It means but something else. But, for example, but I don't believe it. Or, but I've heard it before. Or, but you haven't proved it. That's very interesting. That's implied by that four rise. Whether you then spell it out and say, but I don't believe it, or if you don't spell it out, then it's just left to be understood. Here's another example. Someone says, now when can you let me have your essay? Well, I could do it on Monday. That implies but something else. For example, but not earlier. Or but it'll be a bit of a rush. As compared with, I could do it on Monday. Straightforward for, which doesn't have any special implication like that. The four rise is also often used for negative statements. We've got a not any earlier there. And so we often use it in sentences like, well, that's not very nice. That's not very nice. Where we wouldn't do the same for a positive statement, where we wouldn't have said that's nice. I mean, you can do that with implications and so on, but just being negative is sufficient reason to start using a four rise very often. Now, tone, is this universal? Is it language specific? Probably not. And here's I hope, a good example of a typical difference between English and Japanese, namely the way that WH questions are pronounced. From what I've been told, if we compare English and Japanese for a WH question, the English pattern is, where are you from? Where are you from? For on the nucleus, from. One common Japanese pattern then will be doko kara kita no desu ka, where you have something or other at the beginning, but then a ka with a rise at the end. In English, if you said, where are you from? It would sound really rather strange. I can't really put an interpretation to it. It doesn't sound right. Now, if that's a good example, and I know that Japanese intonation varies in different parts of the country and so on, well then that would be one point of difference between the two languages. I hope that some of you who are interested in this issue can give me some better understanding of what is shared and what is different between Japanese and English intonation. Okay, a little bit of revision now. A says, I'm off to Europe tomorrow. B says, where? Or B says, where? When B says, where? What does that mean? If B says, where? What does that mean? Well, A, B, the first one means, please repeat, where are you going tomorrow? Didn't catch the word Europe. The second one means, well, where in Europe? Is it going to be France? Is it going to be Greece? Is it going to be Italy? Or somewhere else? Thank you to Masaki, by the way, for that example, which he invented. Now, one of the problems about intonation is that there's a lot of it if you go into it in great detail. And so I'm always on the lookout for nice teaching points that you can teach that are fairly self-contained. And one example of this is the matter of question tags. Question tags are very frequent in natural conversation among native speakers, although of course you don't get them in ordinary prose, in ordinary descriptive writing. When we speak, we very often shove in a tag like this. I hear a noise, there's a woman with her mouth open. I might say, well, the lady's singing, isn't she? Number one. Or I might say, B, the lady's singing, isn't she? Those have really rather different meanings. The lady's singing, isn't she? With a falling tag, isn't she? Or the lady's singing, isn't she? With a rising tag. What's the difference in meaning? Well, have I got this here? Yes. The first one, I as the speaker assume that what I say is right, and I assume that you agree with me, because this is part of our shared knowledge. But I just want to check that you do agree with me. So I say, she's singing, isn't she? We're here in Kochi, aren't we? It's just after 4 o'clock, isn't it? I assume it's uncontroversial, but I just want you to acknowledge that that's so. The second possibility with the rise is quite different. For that, I'm not sure, and I want you to tell me what you think. She's singing, isn't she? Or perhaps she's screaming, or perhaps she's had a heart attack. I'm not sure what's going on. I want you to tell me. So it's an uncertainty. It's a real example of a yes-no question. And like other yes-no questions, it has a rise. The first one is much more like an exclamation, so it has a fall. One further basic rule that people could usefully be taught is for longer statements and so on that fall into 2 parts or more parts. We have 2 basic patterns really. When we've got a sort of preliminary or first part followed by a main or second part, then the most frequent pattern in English is a full rise followed by a fall. We have, first of all, one part, and then we have another part, a fall. There are other possibilities, but that's the neutral. But there are other cases where we have the main thing first, and then we add an afterthought, perhaps modifying it or something. And for that, one common pattern is a fall on the main part, followed by a rise. So, with the same words in different orders, here are typical patterns. As far as I know, they'll be in London. Where are they going to be next week? Well, as far as I know, they'll be in London. Can you hear the 4 rise? As far as I know, they'll be in London. As far as I know, they'll be in London. Alternatively, if we have the clauses in the other order, then we typically get, they'll be in London as far as I know. They'll be in London as far as I know. Now, this is not, as I say, the only possibility, but it's an interesting inequality. The 4 rise very often has this meaning of there's something more to come. The rise, amongst its various meanings, is a sort of afterthought modification of what went before. The best known examples of tonicity are when we vary the tonicity on the same sentence, vary the place of the nucleus, corresponding to various different meanings. So we take the sentence, I'm planning to fly to Italy, and we come out with possibilities like, I'm planning to fly to Italy. I'm using a fall there, but I could do it with a fall rise. I'm planning to fly to Italy. I can do it with a rise. I'm planning to fly to Italy. The nucleus, though, is on it. We compare that with putting the nucleus on fly. I'm planning to fly to Italy. I'm planning to fly to Italy. Or with other tones, I'm planning to fly to Italy. I'm planning to fly to Italy. We can put the nucleus on planning. I'm planning to fly to Italy. 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 We can put the nucleus on I'm. I'm planning to fly to Italy. 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 Different tones. With different meanings, as we shall see in a minute. Now, we had a postgraduate student who did some interesting research with Cantonese listeners, in which she took English minimal pairs of sentences which were identical except for one of these 3 dimensions of intonation. and she played them in a randomized order to these Cantonese listeners, and they had to identify which was appropriate in which context. She had a control group who were native speakers of English, who, thank goodness, scored between 95% and 100% on all the tests. But her Cantonese listeners had scores ranging from close to 100% for some parts, down to absolute random results for others. And basically, their success rate for tonality, boundaries, was very good. Their success rate for tone, who, was quite good, fair, but their success rate for tonicity, for the meaning of tonicity, was very poor. They may have been able to hear where the nucleus was, but what they couldn't do was interpret the meaning associated with that choice of a nucleus place. And an example of the kind of sentence where they just didn't understand the meaning difference is here. It's rather low on the screen, I hope you can see it. One possibility was, I don't eat meat, with a fall on meat. I don't eat meat. The other was, I don't eat meat. I don't eat meat, with a fall on eat. I don't eat meat. Now, typical sentences, contexts, where these might have been uttered for native speakers are these. The nucleus on meat would be appropriate in answer to the question, is there anything you don't eat? You've got a guest coming to dinner, you want to check about what's suitable food for them. You might say, now tell me, is there anything you don't eat? They're vegetarians, so they answer, well actually, I don't eat meat. Focusing on meat. Now the second possibility, you might say, okay, we've got some pork, we've got some ham, we've got some beef, which would you like? Which meat do you prefer? The person, you didn't know this, the person is a vegetarian. They say, well, actually, I don't eat meat. Might have a four rise, I don't eat meat. Nucleus on eat now, because we need to focus on that part of it. We don't need to focus on meat. Meat is already given in the context. It's been mentioned. Things that have been mentioned, that are already known, are typically not accented. This is one of the main roles of the location of the place of the nucleus, to signal the end of the new information, to say where I'm focusing on, because everything that follows is old, given, known, shared. Well, Amanda Chung's results, this postgraduate student, do demonstrate that some aspects of English intonation, at least, are highly language specific and therefore ought to be taught and learnt. Let's look in a little bit more detail at this question of nucleus placement. General rule then, we've got to have one nucleus. Some people, by the way, call it a tonic, just synonyms. Halliday calls it the tonic, hence tonicity. One in each intonation phrase, each word group, each sense group, each intonation unit, each tone unit, lots of terms for that as well. I'm calling them IPs or intonation phrases. The nucleus is the most prominent pitch accent. It's the biggest highlight, the most noticeable accent. The place where the nuclear tone movement begins. If it's a fall, this is where the fall starts. If it's a rise, this is where the rise starts. If it's a fall rise, this is where the fall rise starts. In the case of the rise and the fall rise, it'll then be spread over everything that follows as well. In the case of the fall, it typically takes place on that syllable and everything else is low. And the function of tonicity, nucleus placement, is focus, to focus the hearer's attention on this or that part of the message. It signals the end of the focused domain, the focused part. And the neutral to this tonicity then is on the last, well, not the word necessarily, not the last word, but the last content word, more generally the last lexical item. So not typically on prepositions, on pronouns, on grammatical words, function words like that. So here are some typical patterns. What's all the fuss about? Nucleus on fuss, because about is a preposition. Have you had a letter from her? Nucleus on letter, because from her is preposition and pronoun. I did a fall on the first one, a rise on the second one. This is not about tone, this is now about the tonicity. Who are you talking to? To preposition. Why are you avoiding me? Me, pronoun. Oh, yes. This is problematic, for example, for French learners of English. Typical French mistake, I'd call it a mistake, is to say, what's all the fuss about? Have you had a letter from her? Which, sounds awful to English ears. And one of the reasons it sounds awful is that we don't know where we have to focus our attention, because we're not getting the clear signal about focus. So this makes it difficult for us to understand. We speak of broad focus, where everything we say is new, and then the nucleus goes at the end. So, not actually appropriate for the weather we've had, but anyhow, how are you enjoying the course? Well, I don't like the heat. Nucleus on heat at the end. But we also have narrow focus, when we focus on just one part of the intonation phrase and place the nucleus there. I think we'll skip the examples. We don't put the nucleus on repeated items and old information. So the place of the nucleus indicates the end of the new information. Let's go back to our heat. Now somebody might say to you, what do you think of the heat? Heat is now mentioned already. It's old information. So these same words, if used, would have to be said with the nucleus on like. That's the end of the new stuff. I don't like the heat. What do you think of the heat? Well, I don't like it. I don't like the heat. If somebody says, do you like the heat? Now, like the heat is all repeated, all old, so we put the nucleus on the last of the new bit, which is now don't. Now, I don't like the heat. Do you like the heat? No, I don't like the heat. Now tell me, is there anyone here who doesn't like the heat? Well, I don't like the heat. Don't like the heat is all repeated. Nucleus on I. In this particular construction, it probably would have a full rise, negative. Well, I don't like the heat, and contrastive between I and other people. And so, depending on the question that was asked, the same words in the answer would be appropriately structured with the nucleus in different places. Actors in a play, a playwright provides the words they have to say. It's up to the actor to identify the appropriate intonation pattern. And this is one of the very important things that good actors can do correctly, and that sometimes learners of English as a foreign language make a mess of, despite otherwise good acting skills. So we don't accent repeated items. Sally's got a dog. We might ask, we wouldn't say, what breed of dog? That's nonsense. If you say to me, Sally's got a dog, and I say, what breed of dog? You would think either I'm an idiot, or I didn't hear correctly what you said, because my reply would be nonsensical with the nucleus on dog. Dog is repeated, so the proper answer is, what breed of dog? Or what breed of dog? Fall or right. What breed of dog? Here's a more interesting example. Shall we walk to the restaurant? Yes, I prefer to go on foot. Now, the question probably would be with the nucleus on walk. We're talking about going out for a meal this evening, and it's a nice evening, so shall we walk to the restaurant? Or shall we walk to the restaurant? Don't mind what tone, but nucleus on walk. Now, in my answer, I'm not using the word walk, but I'm using a synonym, go on foot. And so we treat it as already given. Yeah, I prefer to do that. I prefer to go on foot. I prefer to go on foot. Another example of the same thing. Can I introduce you to the manager? Here he is. Oh, I've already met Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins is, of course, the manager. And because he's been mentioned, he doesn't need to have his name highlighted the second time round. But you could highlight it if you want to start comparing this manager with other people coming. English is interestingly different from other languages that so far do much the same sort of thing. The French don't, but Spanish is like English in avoiding the placement of the nucleus on a repeated item. But in English, for repetition, we not only consider what's already been said, we also look forward, the speaker does, look forward to what's going to be said. And if I know I'm going to repeat something, then again I don't put the nucleus on it the first time round. So here's your coffee. Would you prefer it with sugar or without sugar? Notice I don't say, would you prefer it with sugar or without sugar? That's nonsense in English. I repeat sugar, and I know I'm going to repeat sugar, so I say with sugar or without sugar. Now, the corresponding thing in Spanish is different. In Spanish, you'd say con azúcar or sin azúcar. You put the nucleus on the sugar word each time. And that strikes us, English speakers, as absurd when Spanish speakers do it in English. Because that's not how it works in English, even though other things work very similarly. So the speaker is always thinking about what he's going to say as well as about what he's said. We can put the nucleus anywhere in the utterance for special contrastive purposes, and we very often do this. I didn't find it easy to write the essay, you might say. Are you asking me? That's different from, are you asking me? Because it suggests a contrast. Are you asking me, or are you asking somebody else? Are you asking Jimmy? Are you asking me? Or perhaps you're telling me. I'm writing a letter. What are you doing? Special nucleus on I'm there because we've got the contrast with you. I'm doing this. Pronouns, I said, are usually not accented, but they are for purposes of contrast. I'm writing a letter. What are you doing? We can also put special placement of the nucleus to indicate a change of polarity from positive to negative or from negative to positive. You took my plate. I didn't take your plate. Nucleus on didn't, because that's the word that carries the negative. To mark tense, do you eat meat? Well, I used to eat meat. Now, eat meat is repeated, of course, but the important new thing is the change of tense to used to, so that's where we put the nucleus. She was trying to lose weight. Where does the nucleus go? What does it mean if I say she was trying to lose weight? It means, but she didn't succeed. If I say she was trying to lose weight, it might be if somebody thought she had been trying to put on weight. I say, no, she wasn't trying to get heavier, she was trying to lose weight. If I say, well, she was trying to lose weight, even if you're not, or even if the others aren't. Now, one thing that you might not think of as being part of intonation, but it is in fact the cause of many Japanese errors in English intonation, concerns compounds, compound nouns in particular, and particularly those that are written as two separate words. If you put the nucleus on an item such as library book, the fall or the rise or whatever has to start on library, because this is a compound, and it therefore has early stress on the first element. I want to change my library book. I'm going to buy some running shoes. If you said, I'm going to buy some running shoes, well, it sounds very strange. It's as if the shoes are running instead of shoes for running. This is a compound noun. I'm going to buy some running shoes. Have you paid the entrance fee? Where does the nucleus go? Entrance fee. Have you paid the entrance fee? It's time to submit a progress report, or American progress report. Where does the nucleus go? Progress report. Because they're compounds. The other problem is this matter of function words, which we can skip over because we've looked at that. Although we can emphasize function words for contrast, as we've seen. Now, another trap that even people who are very good sometimes get wrong is what we refer to as empty words, words that have very little meaning of their own. You hear a noise. There's somebody at the door. No, there isn't. There's no one there. You must be seeing things, or you must be hearing things. Things hasn't much meaning of its own. It's just there to provide an object to a transitive verb. Nucleus doesn't go on it. If you're having a chat with someone in a bar and you think it might be nice for them to go home with you, you might say, let's go back to my place. You wouldn't say, let's go back to my place, because let's go back means somewhere. You've got to go to a where, to a place. So place is sort of predictable. It's an empty word. The important thing is we go back to, in fact, younger people in English now are more and more using the expression, let's go back to mine, which means the same thing, to my place, my house, my flat, my apartment. Oh dear, we've had this embarrassing mistake. Whatever are you going to tell people? You don't need to say what you're going to tell people. That would suggest, well, I'm going to tell animals one thing and I'll tell people something else, which is absurd. No, what are you going to tell people? You know, of course, that the verb tell in English normally requires an object. You can't say, what are you going to tell? So people is there, really for grammatical reasons, just to provide an object. And it's not worthy of being highlighted. The train was crowded, so we decided to catch a later one. I think most of you know about this. One, in this dummy sense, doesn't get accented. It doesn't have any special meaning. A later one, a green one, a red one, a blue one, an earlier one. More interestingly, final adverbs, adverbials of time and place are typically not accented, or quite often not accented, even though they may strictly be new. So you might start a conversation by saying, I had an unexpected letter yesterday. I had an unexpected letter yesterday. We don't have to highlight yesterday. Now, we can do. We can also say, I had an unexpected letter yesterday. Give it its own group, its own intonation phrase with a rise shoved on the end as an afterthought. It's not an essential part of the message. You could just say, I had an unexpected letter. Yesterday is a kind of afterthought. There were a lot of people. There were a lot of people in the room. There's a mosquito. There's a mosquito on your finger. Trickier type involve various syntactic constructions which involve the movement or deletion of a noun phrase, leaving a verb stranded with no object. Here we very typically put the nucleus on the noun, not on the verb. So we say things like, look at the tie he's wearing. Well, our main focus is on the tie, not on the fact that he's wearing it. You might ask a student, how's the homework going? You wouldn't say, how's the homework going? Usually you'd say, how's the homework going? I've still got several topics to cover. I don't know which bus to take. We're getting ready for dinner. We need to have warm plates. Time to put them in the oven. Put the plates to warm. We've got to get the tap fixed. Certain types of relative clause. Where's that sweater I gave you? Where's the book you borrowed? So that's a rather trickier type, more advanced. Including in particular these things involving a WH, which, or whose, or what adjective, followed by a noun, and then some verb stuff. The nucleus goes on the noun. Which route did you take? Whose pen did you borrow? What arrangements have you made? Which hotel are you staying in? What sort of food do you prefer? Compare with that when the noun is not lexically present. If we just say instead, what did you borrow? Then the nucleus goes on the verb. What did you borrow? What have you made? Where are you staying? Nucleus on staying. What do you prefer? Prefer. So it's very specifically these that involve a WH adjective and then a noun after it. The nucleus goes on the noun. So you can see this leads on to more and more complex matters. And it's a matter of it's for the teacher to judge just how complicated to get with any particular level of study. There's simple stuff which is fun for beginners. There's sophisticated syntactic analysis that is suitable material for university students, even at quite a high level. We have a special category called events and disasters, where again the nucleus goes on the noun, not on the verb. These are intransitive verbs typically, so they are final in the sentence. Even so, they don't get the nucleus. Brr, brr, listen, the phone's ringing. We don't say the phone's ringing. What do you expect the phone to do? That's what phones do, they ring. So we focus on the phone. The phone's ringing. No luck. The car won't start. Well, you could say the car won't start. If we're talking about the car, what's the matter with the car? It won't start. But reporting this general disaster, why can't we set off? Well, the car won't start. The car won't start. Watch out, there's a train coming. The fact that it's coming is perhaps not important. The fact is that there is a train about to be here, so there's a train coming. So we emphasize train. Oh dear, my watch has stopped. My watch has stopped. We haven't time to look at phrasal verbs. All we've got time for is to give you a display of the screen about the summer course. There are the details. There is the date. There is the website at the bottom. And we can return to that screen in a minute, but for now I'll say thank you very much, and that's the end of the lecture.